Morena. I'm Bridget. Rick did a great introduction, but I have a lot to cover, so I'm just going to jump into it. So I'm here today to talk about designing UI art. It can be a bit daunting to start. Oh, sorry. Nope, that's not it. My brain is just... There we go. I'm here to talk today about designing UI art. It can be a bit daunting to start designing the UI for a game, especially if you haven't had a lot of previous experience. And I'm going to try and help demystify some of the process and give you some tools for your toolbox. So here's a brief intro about me. I'm an artist at Runaway Play. We make games inspired by nature, primarily for mobile. I do a lot of different types of art, mostly 2D and sometimes a bit of writing. I've done a fair bit of UI and some UX work, and we tend to have relatively small teams of roughly 5 to 10 people working on developing new titles, and 2 or 3 of those will be artists. So we usually have about 1 or 2 people on a team who are making the UI art for a game. And our games tend to have quite a lot of UI, and it's probably about a third of the art resource, though of course it can vary from game to game. So that's just a bit of my background going in. All right, so what am I talking about today? Firstly, user interfaces, or UI, or UI if you really want to be weird. It's a part of the visual design of a game which conveys information that isn't like in the game environment, and it often includes some interactive elements such as menus. When it comes to designing UI for games, the priority is to make it simple and clear. The user interface usually contains crucial information the player needs to see, read, and interact with to understand or fully play the game. Messy and unintuitive UI can make the whole game become confusing or frustrating to interact with. But it's not the only function. Like other aspects of the game, the UI is a part of the overall experience of playing a game. It contributes to the atmosphere and can even be used to further tell a story about the world or characters. First, let's take a step back, though, and go over some basic things to consider about the UI in your game if you're starting out. And then later, I'll talk about some different visual styles of UI, and finally, a toolbox of some other helpful tips for creating your UI. Let's first investigate some of the basics about what your user interface will need. We'll also look at a couple of helpful terms. So let's start with considering some of the things about the game you're making, whether it's barely along or further through development. How will people interact with the UI? UI can be purely about conveying information, or it can take on a more interactive role. Genre can determine this somewhat. Even if you're doing something a bit out of the box, knowing how much UI you're going to need is a good start. For example, many action-adventure, RPG, and shooter games have a lot of items which need an inventory, stats, and information about them. They often have upgrades either in the form of a crafting system or skill points or trees for the player. And these types of games are typically going to have a lot of the menus and overall UI. Simulation-type games are also often very heavy on UI. On the other hand, platformer-type games, they tend to have less menus, and they might even just have like a HUD showing timer, health bar, that kind of thing. And then like puzzle games kind of fall in between, or not even in between, they can be all over the place. And yeah, it's also like, where is the UI? Where is the game? It will really depend in that situation. And then, yeah, there's a lot of other genres, but these are kind of like some examples of the more extreme. All right, size. What is the screen size you're working with? Mobile games are going to be a lot smaller than console games on a TV or a computer. So like in the previous section, thinking about how much information and other content you'll need to show in your UI. will be helpful. If you have a lot to fit on the screen at once, whether it's on the HUD or in a menu, you'll have to be extra careful with how you design it so that it isn't visually overwhelming or have text so small that it's difficult to read. A more minimal style would be beneficial, but more on that later. And also, as an aside, I'm not really going to go too much about accessibility and best practices for UI and UX in this talk, though it is an extremely important part of all UI design. I'll mention things that are relevant here and there, but there are many great resources about this topic, both specifically for games and more broadly. Diegetic and non-diegetic. You may be familiar with these terms from film and TV, but here's a quick rundown as it relates to game design. Diegetic are things that are happening within the game world. In this case, UI. This guy here. He's got some items stored in a compartment. The HUD is showing us a different angle of this so that the player can see it better, but they're literally on his body. Non-diegetic means it's more abstract, it's not literally happening in the world. Most UI fits in this category, like this floating panel representing all the items the characters have. And we're not necessarily meant to believe all these items are in the characters' pockets, but it's not really an important part of the game for us to buy into that. It's generally a lot more practical than a diegetic approach, though. The majority of games with diegetic UI will also have some non-diegetic UI in there. So you want to think about how both of these styles will look and coexist. And for diegetic elements, highly themed UI art will be important. We want it to feel like it's part of the in-game world after all. Wrong one. Speaking of which, I brought up theming, so I'll explain what I mean by that too. Light theming, I would say, tends to be more minimal and have less visual elements that tie it either to the world building or in reinforcing the aesthetic of the game. And I say aesthetical vibe in the sense that the theming doesn't necessarily have to be realistic or exactly match the art style of the rest of the game, just complement it. The benefit of higher theming is that it can strengthen immersion of the game's world, similar to diegesis. So this menu from Final Fantasy XVI looks nice, but it's not really screaming medieval fantasy game. There's some light flourishes here and there. And then on the other very extreme end, there's next to nothing in Yoshi's Woolly World that isn't made from yarn, fabric, or buttons. There's no point in the game where I feel like I'm not living in a woolly world. So here's just a quick recap, because that was a lot of terms. So this UI here is fine. It does the job. This one here is a bit more themed. It's really giving us the vibes of a silly duck game. And then this last one here is diegetic. Great. So let's dive in now to some different art styles of UI. These are some common categories that UI art styles in games fall into. It's not every style, and some games have more facets within them, but it covers a decent range of what's different about each one. Oftentimes, games will combine these styles together. So if you're thinking about the general style you might want to use in your game, you can definitely still pick and choose aspects from others where it's helpful. Theming also comes into play here, and any of these can have light or heavy theming, though some styles tend to lean more towards one or the other. First up, flat. Flat art suggests an appearance of flatness. No shadows, no gradients, no textures, just solid colors. However, the flat UI art style is not actually completely flat most of the time, and it can have a little textures and some motifs. It just doesn't necessarily incorporate a heavy use of textures, gradients, that would give it a greater feel of depth. And you can go into as much or little detail as you want with these flat art styles. And this is the most common style of UI, particularly in more recent games, as it's fairly versatile and often faster to make assets for compared to 3D or painted, for example. It's often more on the minimal end of the spectrum. The most extreme versions of this is if it is textureless and just uses like a simple sans serif font. Functionally, this is pretty good for cases where the player might need to react fast. And it's not usually trying to be particularly highly themed with the game. However, there are some games with a more flat art style, often with 2D art, but also sometimes 3D, that this does visually fit pretty close to. So why is it that so many flat art styles do add this like gradients or transparency that are barely noticeable, instead of just using completely flat colors? Using these subtle gradients or transparency will break up a solid block of color and give it a bit more visual interest, but without making it just a distraction. It also looks a bit more realistic and less artificial, as this is how color and light work in real life. It's similar to other visual art forms, such as painting, whereas if you're trying to add more realism, instead of painting with one color, you usually use a few different but similar hues. Giving a sense of depth through things such as shadows or soft blurred effects like a glow will also help with visual hierarchy. It emphasizes the elements that are more or less important. And you'll see this on buttons, for example. A minimal style can also be used pretty often for like a tech, futuristic, or sci-fi theme, though often with a bit of added texture to make it feel more diegetic, some gradients, and usually a particularly square font. Although I did just talk about aspects that make flat design look less artificial, on the other hand, we're leaning into it here since tech is artificial. Moving on, let's check out a more artistic look. Hand-drawn and painted styles usually have more texture and color than flat styles, though with all of these broad categories, it does still vary a lot. It could be as simple as edges that look more like they're drawn on by pencil or ink than those clean straight lines, or it could be full out and like use actual physical media or imitate that. You tend to see this style mostly when the rest of the game has a similar drawn or painted look. Usually aspects of flat design are combined a lot with this style, and the artistic parts could be anywhere from light touches to being far more intense. 3D. This style is a bit less common, in more modern games especially. As with most styles, games with 3D UI are often combined with flat design as well. And it's more time-consuming to make your UI art like this. You'll have to 3D model and render it, or paint in a fair bit of detail. It's also harder to modify compared to using vector graphics. It can sometimes look a bit dated in older games, though I'd argue this is mostly due to the lower tech, lighting, and rendering of the time. They can also be fairly subtle if you want. Here's an example of this. There's just like this very slight bevel to imply the 3D form. There's a subtle use of wood and metal textures, and it just gives it a nice feeling of physicality. And something the 3D style can do really well is the theming, given the added level of detail you get with the textured or painted models. In 3D games, this can make it feel like you're interacting with the world of the game, even if it's non-diegetic. So for games such as RPGs, which often lean towards a higher level of immersion, it could be a strong option. And 3D styles can also be great for skeuomorphism. Okay, what the heck does that even mean? The simple way of putting it is making something new based on something older, generally to convey that the function works in a similar way. In digital media, this older thing is usually something analog. This is really, really super common in icons. The bin's function, we know what a bin is. It's to delete something, the floppy disk is to save, and so on. Skeuomorphism often goes beyond icons, and it can be applied to many aspects of design. For example, in the last slide, that's the right one. It can be BioShock uses the design of an old-timey cash register to display how much money you have. It is both themed to the early 20th century, like the rest of the game, as well as conveys that these numbers are money. Because the 3D style often has a higher level of realism and physicalness to it, it can often lend itself well to skeuomorphic designs. Skeuomorphism can also be helpful for players who are newer to gaming, or sometimes be a tool useful as a tool to teach a mechanic. VR and serious games, or other applications of using gameplay as a tool to teach something, are both types of games that it is often very helpful to use skeuomorphism for. For instance, VR is a very immersive experience. Players are interacting with the game in a way that's a lot closer to how they would physically interact with things in real life. And it's also still a very new experience to many people. To see some of these UI styles in effect, let's take a look at Flutter Away. This is a game I did some UI work on. Flutter Away is a game for PC and consoles about exploring the Amazon rainforest, interacting with the environment, taking photos, and documenting your findings in the journal. And most of the UI is on-screen prompts of places you can interact, or you can open the camera, or the journal. So this is an example of a game which uses a combination of styles. It uses 3D models for the diegetic parts of the game, which are the journal and camera, and then it uses a hand-drawn style in the journal, and then also some simple flat UI for the HUD, such as those on-screen prompts. A major component to the design of this game is about feeling like you're exploring another location, one that most people will not get the chance to visit. Immersiveness in the game's world is a goal that many video games have. However, other aspects of the game have to be prioritized over immersion, like practicality, accessibility, and making sure it's fun. Let's jump back now to the last couple of styles, pixel art and cartoon. I don't really have too much to say about these styles because they tend to incorporate a lot from the other styles I've already mentioned. Cartoon styles tend to be distinct from 3D because they're not really skeuomorphic or look like anything physical. They can fit into the flat style, but they're not always flat. They can sometimes use a lot of gradients or are painted to give us much more 3D effect. Something in common is that they're often very colorful and have a somewhat childlike vibe. Good for a whimsical tone. So it has a lot of commonalities with other styles, but the sum of its parts feel more like its own thing. Games with pixel art also feel like their own distinct thing visually, but aside from the aesthetic, they tend to be pretty similar to other styles, often flat UI especially. This is partially because pixel art is a bit less visually clear, especially with fonts, so leaning towards simpler flat backings works a lot better. Gradients are also a bit harder to achieve through pixel art, and it also just generally takes longer to make the art with a more 3D realistic look. But there's still a lot of different looks that pixel art can take on. Pixel art overall has a lot of variety, and it's no different for the UI. So to summarize a bit about these different styles, aside from the aesthetic, which will be up to you as to what fits your game, they also have functional benefits to each. Action-based gameplay benefits from clear and simple UI, so a flat or more minimal-leaning 3D style will be best. Having more highly themed, ornately detailed UI is good for less intense moments and parts where you really want the players to feel immersed in the world. Skeuomorphism can also be used for theming and storytelling, but it's also a handy tool to help players understand certain game aspects, functions, or mechanics if they're confused. You may very well have both fast-paced and chill sections in your game, many do, so of course you can combine different styles in your game together where fit. Now I'll cover a few other quick tips about making UI for when you're getting started into making the art. Building your foundation. Assuming some kind of wireframe or layout work is first done, I usually approach UI by building things up and refining them, similar to any other art. I first pick a general vibe of colors and maybe the style I'm going for. Then I'll test and refine the smaller details, adjusting them so that they're versatile across many parts of the game. A good base to start from with colors is either a light base with dark text, or vice versa. If you're in the mid-range, you're at risk of the text being low contrast and hard to read, as well as other icons or images. With fonts, a good rule of thumb is to try and keep your body text font pretty simple for like most of your paragraphs. But you can have a bit more of an exciting header font to tie the theming in and just give it a bit more pizzazz. Finding inspiration. You can find inspiration from all sorts of things. It's not really all that different from how you would go about it with other types of art. It's really more about how you interpret the thing you're inspired by. I like to find images and build a mood board of visual references. Here's some things I find helpful. Different types of materials and how these are rendered, also in the context of different objects and what era or purpose they had. If you're making a fantasy game, for example, then wood and metal and stone are all things you could incorporate in some way. For sci-fi, you can think about digital effects like holograms, scan lines, film grain and noise, pixelation and glitches. Similarly, small details and decorations can be used as decorative motifs. Armor, clothing, book plates, furniture, all sorts of things have these, and different styles based on the time period and region they're from. Graphic design, such as old advertisements from different eras, are great too. GameUIDatabase.com is also a really handy resource, particularly for functionality stuff like a HUD or like a menu layout. It's just really helpful to see what other games use for that, more than like the art itself. And I used it a lot for the images in this show. Oh, and also funny little guys. You should add those. Visual motifs and abstraction. Often in UI, you'll take something and make a design from it that gives the feeling of the original thing, but it doesn't quite literally look like it. It's just more of a suggestion. This is pretty useful for flat and more minimal UI, where you still want some of the theming from decorative elements. Here's a great example from Nier Autonoma, using elements of a musical score as decorative details. Yeah, I just like using this. They've also incorporated a design along the top and bottom edges from the previous Nier game, but they've given it a simpler style so that instead of a fantasy aesthetic, it would fit with the tech one instead. Continuing to build your UI. A helpful way you may find to approach UI is to consider what are the elements that will repeat a lot, and what are some of the most complicated UI features that are going to be in your game. Think about approaching your complex UI feature, which will probably be either a menu or the HUD, like a vertical slice. This will achieve both getting the most complex part out of the way, and also do a lot of the legwork to determine the rest of the UI art style in your game. For example, my repeating elements might be things like a few panels, text buttons, image buttons, headers, page navigation, a drop-down menu, all pretty standard things you'll run into. My more complicated feature might be my crafting menu. It's got a lot of information on it, it's got actions the player can do, it's got this complicated layout and several different styles of icons and text. Or, given the production schedule of your game, it may just be whatever feature is needed or ready to work on. But you can still apply this process. Thankfully, game development is notoriously easy, so, oh wait. There's some other things that often happen and you may need to do. Scale things to many different sizes. Several slight variations of the same thing. and things with many different states, they'll also need variations. You'll end up needing to add more things to a menu, panel, or HUD than you originally planned. You'll completely overhaul a menu or panel you spent so much time on because what needs to be there has changed so much over the course of development. So just be mentally prepared and try to design with flexibility in mind as much as you can. And if you're in a pinch, outlines, drop shadows, outer glow, a funny little friend for moral support. So to wrap this up, if bad UI tends to lend itself to being frustrating, well, good UI often blends in, and you don't notice it because it's seamless and it's doing its job. But it can also be more than that. It can be used to elevate the world building and atmosphere of the game through strong visual style and theming. Functionality is important, but also, looking at the bigger picture, we create games to be immersive and create joy, or sometimes other emotions like being sad, through unique experiences. This talk has hopefully helped to give you the tools to build your UI style. You need to consider and work towards what the game needs, but also, I hope you can bring your own passion to it too, whether you consider yourself an artist or you're new to it. Thanks for listening.
So obviously, Runaway play, you're limited in sort of use of space when you're working on mobile games, but also you guys have made so many lovely kind of rooted in nature games. I was just kind of curious as to whether you ever have discussions about sort of bringing in organic skeuomorphism, like UI that is inspired by the look of the bugs in your games or by fruit, vegetables, plants, organic stuff, right?
Yeah, I would say we do. It's interesting. I've designed a lot of like books and journals over the year. I think it's like we have a lot of books where players will just be recording like things they've collected because there's a lot of like collection aspects in there. I'm kind of sick of them at this point, so I'm trying to like do some other stuff. But yeah, we definitely do. Some games more than others, but I think having something that either is from nature, as you say, or like, yeah, something that makes you feel like you're out in nature, interacting with it, like, yeah, like sketching, writing, that kind of thing. We definitely have that a lot, and, I really like that aspect of it.
Apart from just size, what are the other biggest challenges that come with making UI for a phone?
Oh, I mean, the size thing is tough because you just often have so much stuff to put on a menu at once, and like the more you put on, the smaller it gets. And I think games in particular, compared to maybe some other apps, they're just not the most accessible. They tend to just have some really small fonts this time. So it's definitely that, and that's kind of what I was saying about like just adding more to menus or like changing things up. That just like compounds it because then you suddenly have to like move things around, and yeah, it's just kind of the nature of it. It's like you just don't have that much space to work with, and part of it is also just pushing back with like, do we really need to have this here? Yeah, and I don't know, I haven't really designed for games with like meant to be on a big screen, but at least like if you have a lot of stuff on the page, you do have like a little bit more luxury in that regard.
I'd like to hear a little about your approach to incorporating accessibility into your designs for UIs.
Accessibility. Yeah, our games tend to be like, they're usually for quite a casual audience, and we have a lot of like, we have a diverse like range of ages, but we do have a lot of people who are a bit like older and maybe don't play many games, and sometimes we have a few kids. So it's definitely like things like skeuomorphism and just like they what's the word? We have a lot of like things like controllers where if you like have ever given that to someone who has never played a game like with a controller before, they'll have a really hard time. And there's just like, we don't have controllers for like a mobile game, But there's a lot of like things like that you have to take into account for like just if people aren't used to other games and just things that we take for granted a lot that are like common staples. But yeah, other than that, it's usually like just try to make things like quite large because yeah, just if you have a lot of text, it can get really small and hard to read. Sometimes, yeah, we have a few that we need to fix up a bit, and we sometimes get complaints about that. But yeah, accessibility, definitely like gameplay features as well. It's a very like broad range. Oh yeah, like colors and contrast too. Just there's a lot of like crossover with graphic design where it's just really making things extremely legible. And also icons can be a tough one. Like, you know, there's a lot of icons that I don't want to change it if people are already familiar with it, like, you know, saving, deleting, that kind of thing. But sometimes you have to come up with something that's like very unique to your game, and you're like, how the heck do I like, you know, make this clear? And sometimes you'll be like, well, it's like this, but it looks really similar to another thing we already have. I had one of that once for like a story, for it's like you're interacting with this like story gameplay, but we also had like a book somewhere else, and we had like a live stream function where it's like, all right, and that's like a movie component, so it's like how you convey like a story through not using those. So yeah, sorry, I went on a bit of a tangent there, but yeah, accessibility is just like a huge part of all of UI design, or it should be.
How do you add feedback and interactivity to your designs? Like, when you design them, do you do it in a paint program like Critter or something, or do you make them in Engine?
A bit of both. Usually I use Illustrator and Figma. Yeah, I'll usually like use screenshots and things from the game if I can, but then we do like move them in Engine. So yeah, I usually just like share visual examples and be like, what do you think? Something like Figma or other like prototype kind of type software can be good because you can make them interactive, and that can be really like, it takes a little while, but it can be really good for certain features to just like visually show how something will work. I didn't really talk about it here, but like it's so hard to just like look at something sometimes and like understand how it works. Sometimes it's like you really need to see like animation and like how people interact. If you're like, how do I design this thing? Yeah. Also like making like a video mock-up could be another way you do that, but I like making like a prototype because yeah, it's just literally making like buttons you can press and like transition to something else is like great.
Do you have any advice on maintaining flexibility without overthinking and over-engineering everything?
Yeah, a lot of this like kind of came from experience, I would say. Yeah, for me, a lot of it is like having the time to sort of figure out a lot of what you're doing and what you need from the start helps. I mean, the things change so much, but if you're like, oh, I've kind of got these like styles and things, you can kind of like pivot them a little bit. Yeah, that's a tough one. I also just, as much as I can, if I'm able to, I like to push back a bit on like, you know, if a game designer is like, we need this thing, I'm like, does it have to be here though? Like, it's just always thinking about like, where's the best place to put something? Does it have to be on this menu with a bunch of other things? Are there other things we can like move somewhere else, or just remove entirely? Yeah, it's a lot of back and forth, I would say. It's a tough one, honestly. It'll really depend.